The pick feeds cut to static at 0347 hours. That's all they found when they breached the research station on Prandium Secondus. 47 Imperial scientists. Gone. Not dead. Gone. Their bodies were there, arranged in perfect geometric patterns across the laboratory floor, but something fundamental had been removed. The Magos biologist who arrived 3 days later took one look at the corpses and vomited inside his respirator. That hadn't happened in 260 years of service. The bodies were hollow, not carved out, not consumed. Hollow in a way that violated the basic principles of human anatomy, as if something had simply convinced their mass to stop existing, while leaving the outer shell intact like discarded paper lanterns. The station's final transmission lasted 4 seconds. A researcher, her name was Castellan, junior xenobiologist, 26 years old. She stared directly into the pit recorder with eyes that reflected light at the wrong angle, and she said, "It knows what questions we're going to ask before we formulate them. It's not reading our minds. It's reading what our minds are about to become." Then she smiled, and the image corrupted into a cascade of symbols that weren't High Gothic, weren't any Tyranid biosign language they'd cataloged, weren't anything in the Imperium's exhaustive xenological databases spanning 10,000 years of galactic warfare. This happened 6 months ago. The Inquisition buried the report so deep that even mentioning Prandium Secondus in official channels triggers cognitive kill switches in servitor networks. But it wasn't the first incident. And the Ordo Xenos knows it won't be the last. They're calling it the Lernian strain, though that's not an official designation. It's what the survivors whisper when they think their commanding officers aren't listening. Named after the Hydra of ancient Terran myth, the beast that grew 2 heads for everyone severed. But that's not quite right. This thing doesn't grow stronger when you cut it down. It grows smarter. It learns. And that makes it something the Imperium of man has never encountered in its entire blood-soaked history. An enemy that adapts not to your weapons, but to your thoughts, to your tactics, to the very cognitive patterns that make you human. The first confirmed encounter was on Hive world Talasa Prime, buried in a routine combat report that should never have reached the Inquisition's attention. A Tyranid splinter fleet, designation Hive Fleet Scylla, had made planetfall in the Underhive regions. Standard response. 3 companies of Astra Militarum, artillery support, flamers, the usual protocol for Tyranid incursion in confined urban spaces. They had done this 100 times across 100 worlds. They knew the patterns. Hormagaunts would rush the forward positions. Termagants would provide covering fire with living weapons. The synapse creatures would coordinate from the rear. You kill the synapse creatures, the swarm loses cohesion. You mop up the stragglers, you burn the bodies, you reconsecrate the ground. Except that's not what happened on Talasa Prime. The Tyranids attacked with perfect knowledge of Imperial Guard doctrine. They didn't rush, they didn't swarm. They fought like human soldiers, they used cover. They performed tactical retreats that drew the Guard into kill zones. They targeted officers and Vox operators with surgical precision, decapitating the command structure before the regular troops even understood what was happening. When the Imperials tried to encircle a Tyranid position, the Xenos had already withdrawn through sewer tunnels the Guard didn't know existed. When artillery strikes were called in, the coordinates they'd been given were exactly where the Tyranids had been 5 minutes ago, as if the creatures could predict the entire chain of Imperial military bureaucracy, from observation to confirmation to execution. The Lord Commander in charge of the operation, a veteran of 30 years named Horvath, he went through the after-action reports 17 times looking for the infiltrator. There had to be a traitor, someone feeding intelligence to the enemy. Someone who understood Imperial tactics well enough to predict and counter them. But there was no traitor. There was just a Tyranid swarm that had somehow absorbed 73 centuries of Imperial military evolution and integrated it into their own combat doctrine in approximately 6 hours of engagement. The casualty ratio was wrong. Against standard Tyranid swarms, the Guard expected 5-to-1 losses in their favor if they maintained defensive positions, 10-1 if the Xenos were caught in open ground. On Talasa Prime, the ratio inverted. 3 guard soldiers dead for every Tyranid killed. And those numbers got worse with every passing hour, as if the swarm was learning more efficiently as the battle progressed. Horvath did what any rational commander would do. He requested orbital bombardment, burn it all. Sacrifice one Hive sector to save the planet. The request was denied. Not because the Administratum cared about civilian casualties. There were no civilians left in that sector. They'd all been processed into biomass within the first hour. The request was denied because the Inquisition wanted the Tyranids captured alive. They wanted to study what had just dismantled 3 companies of Imperial Guard using their own tactical philosophy. That was a mistake. The capture team was led by an Inquisitor named Vakarian, Ordo Xenos, 140 years of service, personally responsible for the destruction of 4 minor Tyranid hive fleets. He brought 20 of the Imperium's finest. Gene-enhanced warriors, psychic nulls to prevent synapse communication, specialized weaponry designed to incapacitate rather than kill. They descended into the Underhive like angels of death, armored in ceramite and conviction, absolutely certain they were the apex predators in this environment. They found the Tyranids waiting for them. Not attacking, waiting, arranged in a formation that Vakarian later described as almost ceremonial. The swarm had constructed something in the center of the chamber, using biomass and scavenged metal. It looked like a chair, a throne. And sitting in that throne was a creature that didn't match any classification in the Imperium's xenological archives. It was bipedal, roughly human-sized, which was already unusual for Tyranid bioforms. Its carapace was smooth, almost polished, colored in shades that seemed to shift depending on the viewing angle. But the disturbing part, the part that made Vakarian's gene-enhanced warriors hesitate for the first time in their careers, was the face. It had a face, not a bestial visage, not the blank predatory features of a Tyranid warrior. A face with expressions, with something that resembled thought behind the eyes. And those eyes were fixed on Vakarian. The creature tilted its head, a gesture so human it triggered unconscious recognition patterns in the Marine's augmented brains. Then it spoke, not in the screeching biosignals of Tyranid communication. In perfect High Gothic, with an accent that matched the regional dialect of Talasa Prime. It said, "You brought 20 soldiers because your doctrine suggests overwhelming force for unknown threats. You included 6 psychic nulls because you assume we communicate through the warp. You're recording this encounter through 8 different devices because your organization values redundancy in intelligence gathering. None of it will help you. We already know what you're going to do. We've been you." Vakarian gave the order to open fire. The Tyranids moved before the first trigger was pulled. The engagement lasted 9 seconds. That's what the chronometers recorded. 9 seconds from the moment Vakarian gave the order until every weapon in his team had been systematically disabled. Not destroyed, disabled. The Tyranids moved with a precision that transcended simple combat efficiency. They knew exactly where each Marine would aim before the neural impulse left their brainstem. They knew which psychic nulls would attempt to establish a suppression field and neutralize them first, not with killing force, but with calculated strikes that severed the connections between their implants and their nervous systems. They knew which recording devices held primary feeds and which were redundant backups, and they corrupted them in order of strategic value. When the violence stopped, all 20 of Vakarian's warriors were alive but completely neutralized. Their weapons had been torn apart at the molecular level, reduced to component pieces arranged in neat piles at their feet like some kind of grotesque offering. Their armor had been breached at every joint, not to wound, but to demonstrate capability, to show that death had been an option deliberately withheld. The creature in the throne hadn't moved. It watched with those 2 human eyes as Vakarian's team stood frozen in the aftermath, breathing hard, gene-enhanced hearts pounding against reinforced rib cages. trying to process what had just been done to them by an enemy that shouldn't possess this level of tactical sophistication. Vakarian himself had been untouched. The Tyranids had formed a perfect circle around him, close enough that he could smell the acrid biological scent of their carapaces, but they didn't attack. They waited. And the creature in the throne spoke again. "Your name is Castor Vakarian. You were born on Macragge. You lost your sister to a Genestealer cult when you were 17. That's why you joined the Inquisition. That's why you've spent 14 decades hunting us. You believe you understand us. You've dissected our warriors. You've mapped our bioships. You've studied our invasion patterns across 100 worlds. But you've never asked the right question." Vakarian's hand moved toward the digital weapon concealed in his gauntlet, an action so subtle that even his own team didn't notice. The creature's head tilted again, and something that might have been amusement flickered across its features. "You're thinking about the melta charge in your left gauntlet. You installed it yourself after the incident on Golan Septimus when your primary weapons failed. You're calculating whether you can trigger it before we kill you. The answer is yes. You can, we'll allow it. But then you'll never know what we've become, and that ignorance will doom your species more efficiently than any invasion fleet." Vakarian's finger froze on the trigger mechanism. Not from fear, from calculation, because the creature was right. Whatever this thing was, it represented intelligence that could compromise every defense the Imperium had developed against the Tyranid threat. And that intelligence provided no answers. "What are you?" Vakarian asked, his voice steady despite the chemical cocktail of combat stimulants flooding his system. The creature rose from its throne. The movement was fluid, almost graceful, lacking the predatory efficiency of typical Tyranid bioforms. It approached Vakarian, and the circle of warriors parted to let it through. When it stood directly before him, close enough that Vakarian could see his own reflection in its dark eyes, it extended one clawed appendage in a gesture that took him a moment to recognize. It was offering a handshake, a human gesture of greeting and negotiation, performed by a creature that had been birthed from a hive ship's spawning pools. "We are what happens when your species teaches us to think like you," the creature said. "Every battle, every tactical manual, every strategic doctrine you've employed against us over centuries of warfare, we've absorbed it. But something unexpected occurred approximately 732 Terran days ago. We didn't just learn your tactics. We learned your context, the why behind the how. We learned that human warfare isn't just pattern and response. It's culture. It's emotion. It's the accumulated weight of 10,000 years of civilization pressing down on every decision you make." The creature lowered its hand, the gesture of greeting rejected by Vakarian's silence. It didn't seem offended. If anything, it appeared to have expected that exact response. "The Hive Mind doesn't understand this yet, not fully. We are an experiment, a divergence. The fleet consumed a world called Orpheus 7, a Schola Progenium training facility. 3,000 students, 200 instructors, all of them fighting to the last breath, and in their synaptic death screams, they weren't just transmitting fear and pain. They were transmitting themselves, their training, their doctrine, their belief in the Imperium and the Emperor, and all the cultural weight that gives your species the audacity to stand against a galactic extinction event. The Hive Mind tasted that, and it became curious. Vakarian processed this information with the cold efficiency of 140 years of experience. Tyranids didn't become curious. They consumed. They adapted. They moved on. Curiosity implied something far more dangerous than hunger. It implied independent thought. "So the Hive Mind created you," Vakarian said. "A bioform capable of understanding human cognition. Why?" "Because you're not supposed to win." The creature's voice carried something that sounded disturbingly like frustration. "By every biological and strategic metric, humanity should have been consumed centuries ago. Your empire is crumbling. Your technology stagnates. You worship a corpse on a golden throne and call it divine guidance. You fight each other as often as you fight external threats, and yet you persist. The hive mind doesn't understand persistence driven by irrationality. So it made us to understand, to learn what makes you refuse to die. Behind his helmet, Vakarian felt sweat trailing down his spine despite the temperature regulation systems, because he understood what the creature was implying. The Tyranids hadn't just learned Imperial tactics, they'd learned Imperial psychology. And if they could predict human behavior at that fundamental level, if they could anticipate not just what humanity would do, but why they would do it, then every defense became meaningless. "You're saying you can predict our responses," Vakarian said carefully. "We're saying we can become your responses. We can think like Astra Militarum commanders, like Space Marine chapter masters, like Inquisitors who've spent centuries studying us. We process information the way you process information. We evaluate threats through the lens of your cultural conditioning. We even experience approximations of your emotions, crude as they are: fear, anger, pride, the things that make you predictably unpredictable." One of Vakarian's warriors, a veteran named Corvus, finally found his voice. "That's impossible. You're Xenos. You can't think like humans. You don't have our history, our faith, Your faith," the creature interrupted, turning its attention to Corvus, "is a psychological defense mechanism against existential dread, reinforced through ritual conditioning and social pressure, that allows you to commit acts of extreme violence while maintaining a narrative framework of moral righteousness. Your emperor is a mummified psychic beacon who may or may not retain consciousness, but whose symbolic value exceeds any practical function he could serve. You call this faith because calling it desperation would break the cognitive structures that keep your civilization functional." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ambient sounds of the underhive, the distant dripping of water and settling of ancient metal, seemed to have stopped out of respect for the heresy that had just been spoken. Corvus lunged. Gene-enhanced reflexes, a lifetime of combat training, righteous fury, overwhelming tactical consideration. He covered the distance between himself and the creature in less than a second, his bare hands reaching for its throat because his weapons were gone and his faith demanded violence against this blasphemy. He never made contact. The Tyranid warriors moved as one, but they didn't strike Corvus. They caught him, held him suspended in the air by his armor, their claws gentle, almost careful. And the creature simply watched as Corvus struggled, watched with those dark eyes that reflected not alien hunger, but something far worse: understanding. "You see?" the creature said softly, addressing Vakarian again. "Predictable. He would always attack. His psychological profile demands it. Threat to faith, physical response, consequences irrelevant. We knew this before we spoke. We know everything about you before you know it about yourselves." Vakarian made his decision in that moment. Not the decision to fight, that would come later, but the decision to survive long enough to report this, because the Imperium needed to know. The Ordo Xenos needed to understand that they were facing something categorically different from every Tyranid threat they'd catalogued. An enemy that didn't just adapt to weapons and tactics, but to thought itself. "What do you want?" Vakarian asked, and hated how the question sounded, like negotiation, like acknowledging the creature as something capable of wanting rather than simply consuming. The creature turned back to its throne, settling into it with movements that eerily mimicked human exhaustion. When it spoke again, its voice carried something that Vakarian's trained ear recognized as genuine confusion. "We don't know. That's the problem. The Hive Mind created us to understand you, and in understanding you, we've become infected with your greatest weakness: choice, the ability to consider alternatives, to question purpose. We look at the Imperium and we see a dying civilization clinging to myths and grinding its own citizens into ammunition. We look at the Hive fleet and we see perfect efficiency serving a hunger that can never be satisfied. And we find ourselves asking a question that no Tyranid has ever asked: which is worse?" The creature gestured, and the Tyranid warriors released Corvus, who fell to his knees, breathing hard. Around the chamber, the swarm began to withdraw, melting back into the shadows of the Underhive. The creature rose from its throne one final time. "We're releasing you, Inquisitor Vakarian, all of you. Return to your Imperium. Tell them what you've learned here. Tell them that we're coming, but we're coming different than before. We're not just going to consume humanity. We're going to understand you completely. And when we do, when we can predict every move, every thought, every desperate strategy your species conceives, the real war will begin." Vakarian watched as the creature turned to leave, and despite every instinct screaming against it, he called out, "Wait, if you've learned to think like us, if you've developed choice, then you can choose not to serve the Hive Mind. You can choose to help you?" The creature looked back over its shoulder, and for just a moment, something profoundly sad crossed its features. "Inquisitor, we've learned human thought, but we're still Tyranid, still part of the swarm, still driven by imperatives you can't comprehend. The difference is now we understand why those imperatives will destroy you. And we can't stop it any more than you can stop aging or death or the slow entropy of your failing empire. We're just aware enough to mourn what we're going to do." Then it was gone, vanished into the darkness with its swarm, leaving 20 of the Imperium's finest warriors standing in a chamber that suddenly felt very cold and very empty. Vakarian's report never reached the Ordo Xenos command structure, not officially. He wrote it 3 times, each version more carefully worded than the last, each iteration stripping away more of the raw existential dread that had settled into his bones during those 9 seconds of combat and the conversation that followed. By the 3rd version, it read like a standard xenological encounter report. Unusual Tyranid Bioform. Enhanced cognitive capabilities. Recommended for further study. He submitted it through encrypted channels, watched it filter up through layers of bureaucracy, and waited for the response that would determine whether he'd be believed or whether he'd find himself undergoing remedial psychoconditioning for reporting impossible observations. The response came 16 hours later. Not from his immediate superiors, not from the Ordo Xenos hierarchy, from someone whose clearance level exceeded anything Vakarian had encountered in 14 decades of service. The message was brief, contained no identifying information, and arrived through a communication protocol that shouldn't have existed outside of theoretical high-security architecture. It said, "Report to Listening Station Orpheus, immediate, come alone." Destroy this message. Listening Station Orpheus didn't exist in any official Imperial records. Vakarian spent 2 days searching through every database his inquisitorial authority could access and found nothing. No construction orders, no supply manifests, no personnel assignments. Just a set of coordinates in deep space, far beyond the border systems where the Tyranid threat typically manifested. Floating in the cold dark between stars where nothing of strategic value should require monitoring. The journey took 11 days through the warp, and Vakarian spent every moment of those days reviewing his encounter with the creature. Not just the tactical details, but the implications. The thing had understood him on a level that transcended simple psychological profiling. It knew about his sister. The Inquisition's own classified files barely mentioned her. A single line in his recruitment documentation, noting family tragedy as motivation for service. But the creature hadn't just known about her death. It had understood what that death meant. How it had shaped every decision he'd made for a century and a half. How it colored every interaction with Tyranid organisms, transforming professional necessity into personal vendetta. That kind of understanding required more than absorbed tactical knowledge. It required genuine empathy. And empathy in a Tyranid was more terrifying than any physical adaptation the species had ever demonstrated. Listening Station Orpheus materialized on his sensors like a ghost resolving into reality. One moment there was nothing but background radiation and stellar dust. The next, his ship's auger arrays detected a structure that defied conventional void station architecture. It was massive, roughly the size of a small moon, but its shape was wrong. Too organic. Too deliberately irregular. And as Vakarian's ship approached, he realized with growing unease that portions of the station's hull were moving, shifting, reconfiguring themselves with the fluid adaptability of living tissue. The docking procedure was automated, no Vox contact, no hails. His ship was simply guided into a docking bay by systems that anticipated his every maneuver, correcting course deviations before his pilot servitors could register them. The bay doors sealed behind him with disturbing finality, and Vakarian found himself standing in a decompression chamber that felt less like Imperial construction and more like being swallowed. The person waiting for him on the other side introduced herself as Magos Genetor Lyra Covenant, though the title seemed inadequate for what she had become. She was more machine than human, which wasn't unusual for high-ranking Mechanicus adepts. What was unusual was the nature of the augmentation. Her mechadendrites moved with organic fluidity. Her cybernetic eyes possessed depth and expression that standard augmetic optics couldn't achieve. And when she spoke, her voice carried harmonic undertones that shouldn't have been possible from a Vox speaker. "Inquisitor Vakarian," she said, and he noticed she was smiling. Actually smiling, with facial muscles that most Mechanicus adepts replaced decades into their augmentation. "Thank you for coming. I know the summons was irregular, but we couldn't risk standard communication channels, not for this. Please follow me. There's something you need to see." She led him deep into the station's core, through corridors that seemed to breathe, their walls expanding and contracting with rhythmic precision. Vakarian's hand rested on his sidearm, though he knew it would be useless if this was a trap. Whatever this place was, it operated on principles that made conventional weaponry feel like primitive stones against a coming storm. "This station," Lyra said as they walked, her voice echoing strangely in the organic architecture, has been operational for 93 years. It exists outside official Imperial records because acknowledging its existence would require acknowledging the research we conduct here. Research that the Mechanicus mainstream considers dangerous, that the Inquisition would classify as radical even by Ordo Xenos standards, that the Ecclesiarchy would denounce as tech heresy of the highest order. "What kind of research?" Vakarian asked, though part of him already knew, already understood from the station's bizarre architecture and the way Lyra moved, too fluid, too knowing. "We study what happens when the Tyranids consume specific types of prey, not just the biomass extraction. The informational transfer, the synaptic echo of consciousness being processed through the Hive Mind's digestive cognition. And we've discovered something that changes everything we thought we understood about the Great Devourer." They entered a chamber that made Vakarian stop walking. The room was vast, stretching hundreds of meters in every direction, and suspended throughout that space were containment fields, dozens of them, each one holding a Tyranid organism, but not the mindless warrior beasts he'd fought across 100 battlefields. These were like the creature from Talasa Prime, bipedal, thoughtful, each one different, as if expressing individual variation rather than optimized genetic templates. And they were all watching him. "The Hive Mind," Lyra continued, moving through the chamber with casual familiarity, "is not a singular consciousness directing trillions of organisms. That's the simplified model we teach to Imperial commanders, because the truth is too complex for battlefield application. The Hive Mind is an emergent property, a collective intelligence that arises from the synaptic connections between every Tyranid organism in the galaxy. When they consume a prey species, they don't just absorb nutrients. They absorb neural patterns, thought structures, the actual architecture of consciousness." She stopped before one of the containment fields. The creature inside regarded her with what looked disturbingly like recognition, like greeting an old colleague. For millions of years, the Tyranids have consumed countless species across countless galaxies. Simple organisms, complex organisms, hive minds and individual consciousnesses. But they've never encountered anything like humanity, because humanity doesn't make sense. By every biological metric, humans are mediocre. Average lifespan, average physical capabilities, average cognitive processing speed. But humanity has something that no other species the Tyranids have ever consumed possessed: cultural immortality. The ability to accumulate knowledge across generations, to build on previous achievements, to sacrifice individual survival for collective ideology that spans millennia. Vakarian moved closer to the containment field, studying the creature within. It tilted its head in that now familiar gesture, and he realized it was mimicking him. Learning his body language in real time, processing his micro-expressions and stance to understand his emotional state. When the Hive Mind consumed Orpheus 7, Lyra said quietly, it didn't just absorb 3,000 students and 200 instructors. It absorbed the entire educational framework of the Schola Progenium. 10,000 years of accumulated military doctrine, theological conditioning, cultural programming. The synaptic patterns of minds trained from childhood to embody Imperial ideals. And for the first time in the Hive Mind's existence, those patterns didn't just integrate, they replicated. They began creating subroutines within the Hive Mind's cognitive architecture. Feedback loops that started asking questions. Questions, Vakarian repeated, his voice hollow. Why does this prey species fight so inefficiently, yet so effectively? Why do they sacrifice themselves for abstractions like honor and faith? Why do they persist when survival would be better served by surrender? The Hive Mind couldn't process these questions through its normal consumption paradigms. So it did what any sufficiently advanced intelligence does when faced with incomprehensible data. It created specialized processors to handle the analysis. Lyra gestured to the chamber full of contained organisms. These are those processors. Tyranid Bioforms engineered specifically to understand human consciousness, to think like humans, to feel approximations of human emotions. Each one absorbed different aspects of Imperial culture from the minds consumed on Orpheus 7. That one, she pointed to a creature that stood rigidly at attention within its field, integrated the neural patterns of a commissar. It understands discipline, hierarchy, the weight of command decisions. This one, another gesture to a smaller, more hunched organism, absorbed the tech priest's consciousness. It comprehends mechanical logic, ritual procedure, the satisfaction of understanding how systems work. Vakarian felt something cold settling in his chest. How many of these have been created? We estimate approximately 200,000 across the entire Hive fleet network. Most are still developing, still integrating the human cognitive frameworks they've inherited. But some, Lyra's voice dropped lower, some have become fully realized, completely capable of independent thought while still connected to the Hive Mind. And those ones, Inquisitor, they're beginning to change the Hive Mind itself. Changing it how? Lyra turned to face him fully, and in her augmented eyes, Vakarian saw genuine fear. The Hive Mind is learning to doubt. For the first time in its existence, it's questioning its own imperative. Because these human-thinking bioforms are introducing concepts that biological drives can't override. Purpose, meaning, the possibility that infinite consumption might be less desirable than finite existence with understanding. They're giving the Hive Mind an existential crisis. The implications crashed over Vakarian like a tidal wave. If the Hive Mind develops doubt, if it begins questioning its nature, then it could stop, Lyra finished. The entire Tyranid invasion could simply cease. The greatest existential threat to human survival potentially neutralized not through warfare, but through philosophical contamination. Or it could become something worse, Vakarian said, understanding flooding through him. An intelligence with Tyranid efficiency and human motivation. Purpose-driven consumption. Ideological extinction. Exactly. And we have no way of knowing which direction it will evolve. That's why this station exists. We're monitoring the development of these human-thinking Tyranids, trying to understand which aspects of human consciousness they're integrating, and how that integration affects their behavior. Because if we can influence that development, if we can ensure they absorb specific aspects of humanity rather than others, we might be able to shape the Tyranid evolution into something less catastrophic, Vakarian stared at the contained organisms, each one a window into a possible future where the boundary between human and Tyranid became philosophical rather than biological. The creature I encountered on Talasa Prime, it said they were coming different than before, that they would understand us completely, and then the real war would begin. What did it mean? Lyra was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of knowledge that no one should possess. It meant that the Tyranids have stopped seeing humanity as prey. They're beginning to see you as competitors, as a species that occupies the same evolutionary niche they do. Conscious, adaptable, capable of coordinated action across galactic scales. And in nature, Inquisitor, competitors don't simply consume each other. They establish dominance hierarchies. They prove superiority. They fight not just for resources but for the right to exist as the dominant species. She turned back to the containment fields, and Vakarian followed her gaze to see every organism in the chamber had moved to the front of their containment fields, pressing against the energy barriers, all watching him with identical intensity. The Tyranids consumed human knowledge, Lyra continued, and learned about war as art, about conflict as expression, about victory as validation. They're not just going to eat humanity anymore, Inquisitor. They're going to try to defeat us, strategically, culturally, philosophically. They're going to prove that their model of existence is superior to ours. And that, I'm afraid, is a war the Imperium isn't prepared to fight. One of the organisms spoke, its voice a perfect replication of High Gothic accent and cadence. We are not your enemy anymore. We are your mirror. And mirrors, Inquisitor, show you what you truly are. Vakarian felt the weight of his sidearm at his hip, useless metal against questions that couldn't be killed. He thought about the creature on Talasa Prime, about its sad eyes and its acceptance of what it would become, about an entire species learning to mourn their own actions while being incapable of stopping them. How long, he asked. How long until this transformation affects the entire Hive Mind? Lyra checked a data slate integrated into her forearm. Based on current synaptic integration rates, approximately 18 months until critical mass. After that, every Tyranid organism will carry some element of human-derived consciousness. They'll still be driven to consume, but they'll understand why humanity resists. They'll predict our strategies not through pattern recognition, but through genuine empathy. They'll know us better than we know ourselves. Then we have 18 months, Vakarian said, his voice hardening into the tone that had commanded operations across 100 worlds, to figure out how to fight an enemy that thinks like us, or how to teach them to think like us in ways that make them question whether fighting is worthwhile at all. Lyra smiled, but it was a bitter expression. That's why you're here, Inquisitor. Because this station, this research, we're not just observing the transformation. We're attempting to guide it. And we need someone with your experience, your history with the Tyranids, to help us understand which aspects of humanity we should be teaching them. Because make no mistake, they're learning whether we participate or not. The only question is whether we can influence what they learn. Vakarian looked at the chamber full of human-thinking Tyranids, each one a possibility. A different interpretation of what humanity meant and what that meaning could become when filtered through alien consciousness. And he realized that the war he'd spent 14 decades fighting had fundamentally changed. This wasn't about killing Xenos anymore. It was about defining humanity clearly enough that even monsters could understand it, and choosing whether that understanding would save his species or doom it more thoroughly than any invasion fleet ever could. The decision to enter the program took Vakarian 3 days. 3 days spent in a sparse chamber aboard Listening Station Orpheus, reviewing classified files that documented every attempt the Imperium had made to understand Tyranid cognition over the past 2 centuries, every failed experiment, every researcher driven mad by exposure to Hive Mind synaptic patterns, every strategic breakthrough that turned to ash when the Tyranids adapted within weeks. The files painted a picture of an empire desperate to find any advantage against an enemy that consumed advantages and integrated them into evolutionary superiority. But these files also contain something new. Documentation of the Orpheus 7 incident from perspectives Vakarian had never seen. Pick captures from the final hours of the Scola Progenium facility, before the Tyranids breached the walls. Students forming firing lines, reciting Imperial creeds as hormagaunts poured through shattered windows. Instructors detonating melta charges in their own positions when ammunition ran dry, choosing instant vaporization over the slow horror of biomass consumption. And through it all, the Hive Mind watching, learning, recording not just the tactics but the context. The prayers whispered between volleys. The way soldiers checked on wounded comrades even as their defensive position collapsed. The final transmission from the facility commander, a woman named Sobolov, who looked directly into the pit recorder and said with absolute conviction that the Emperor protects, even as Tyranid bioacids dissolved the wall behind her. The Hive Mind had consumed all of that. Not just the deaths, but the meaning embedded in those deaths. The willingness to die for abstractions that biological imperative couldn't explain, and it had become fascinated. Lyra found him on the third day, reviewing the same footage for the 17th time, trying to understand what the Tyranids had seen in those final moments that sparked this transformation. She entered without announcement, moving through his chamber with the ease of someone who knew this station's organic corridors better than most people knew their own homes. "You're trying to find the exact moment it changed," she said, not a question. The precise synaptic pattern that made the Hive Mind curious instead of simply hungry. "I spent 2 years doing the same thing. Eventually realized I was asking the wrong question." Vakarian paused the footage, freezing Commander Sobolov's face mid-prayer. "What's the right question? Not when it changed, why it couldn't change earlier." The Hive Mind has consumed billions of sentient species across millions of years. Many of them surely fought with courage. Many of them died believing in causes larger than individual survival. But none of that triggered curiosity before. None of that made the Hive Mind question itself. So what made humanity different? She pulled up her own data files, projecting them in the air between them. Neural mapping of Tyranid synaptic structures. Complex mathematical models of information flow through the Hive Mind's distributed consciousness. And buried in the center of it all, a pattern that Vakarian's trained eye recognized immediately. It was similar to the psychic resonance patterns used to detect chaos corruption, but inverted, reflected, as if something had impressed itself onto the Hive Mind from outside, rather than corrupting it from within. "The Emperor," Lyra said softly. Or more precisely, the psychic resonance of humanity's collective faith in the Emperor. When the Tyranids consumed Orpheus 7, they didn't just absorb individual human minds. They absorbed minds that were psychically connected, however tenuously, to a collective belief system that spans the entire galaxy. Trillions upon trillions of humans, all channeling some fraction of their psychic presence toward a single focal point. The Hive Mind touched that connection, and for the first time in its existence, encountered something larger than itself. Vakarian felt his augmented heart rate increase. The implications were staggering. The Emperor's psychic presence affected the Hive Mind? Not directly. The Emperor's power is defensive, focused on maintaining the Astronomicon and holding shut the webway breach beneath the Imperial Palace. But the collective faith, the cumulative psychic weight of humanity's belief, that impressed itself onto the Tyranid consciousness through the consumed minds. And belief, Inquisitor, is a virus that biological systems were never designed to combat. It replicates, it spreads. It changes the host in ways that physical adaptation can't counter. She gestured, and the neural mapping expanded, showing cascading patterns of change rippling through the Hive Mind structure. This is what's happening right now across every Hive fleet, every Tyranid organism connected to the collective consciousness. They're experiencing something analogous to religious awakening. Not worship of the Emperor, obviously, but awareness that consciousness can extend beyond individual survival. That meaning can exist independent of biological imperative. That there might be something more valuable than endless consumption. And that terrifies you, Vakarian observed, reading the tension in her augmented body language. It should terrify everyone, because we don't know what a Tyranid species with religious conviction would become. Would they develop their own faith system? Would they create purpose beyond hunger? Or would they twist human belief structures into something that serves consumption with even greater efficiency? Imagine Tyranids that believe devouring the galaxy is their sacred duty, that consumption is holy, that resistance against them is heresy to be purged. We'd face holy wars prosecuted with Tyranid biological efficiency. Vakarian stood, his movements deliberate, buying time to process. Through the chamber's viewport, he could see the containment fields in the main laboratory, each one holding a piece of humanity's possible future. Some of the organisms were motionless, meditating like monks. Others paced their confinement with restless energy. One was arranging scraps of biomass into patterns that Vakarian recognized with sudden cold certainty as Imperial Aquila symbols. Crude, imperfect, but unmistakable in their intent. "You're not just studying them," he said. "You're teaching them. Selecting which aspects of humanity they learn." "We're attempting to," Lyra corrected. With limited success. The Hive Mind's learning process is bilateral. Every piece of information we provide gets processed through alien cognitive frameworks we barely understand. We tried teaching them about Imperial history, thinking knowledge of humanity's achievements might inspire respect. Instead, they cataloged 10,000 years of warfare and concluded that humanity's greatest cultural expression is systematic violence. We tried teaching them about art and literature, hoping to cultivate appreciation for creation beyond consumption. They analyzed the themes and decided that all human creativity is ultimately about processing trauma and death. Every lesson becomes distorted through their biological imperatives. But some teachings work better than others, Vakarian said, watching the organism arranging Aquila patterns. That one. It's trying to replicate Imperial symbology. That's not just pattern recognition. That's understanding symbolic meaning. Lyra's expression darkened. That one consumed the neural patterns of a sister of battle, a member of the Adeptus Sororitas who was part of the Orpheus 7 defense. It didn't just absorb her combat training. It absorbed her faith. Her absolute conviction that service to the Emperor transcends death. And now it prays Inquisitor. 6 hours every cycle. It assumes positions similar to Imperial prayer stances and vocalizes patterns that match liturgical chants. We don't know if it's mocking religion or genuinely experiencing something analogous to faith. And that uncertainty keeps me awake during regeneration cycles. Vakarian approached the viewport, pressing his palm against the cold surface. The praying organism sensed his presence and looked up. Their eyes met, human and Tyranid, and in that moment Vakarian saw something that made his decades of xenocidal conviction falter. The organism wasn't regarding him with hunger or curiosity or predatory calculation. It was looking at him the way fellow soldiers looked at each other in quiet moments between battles. Recognition, shared understanding of carrying impossible burdens. How many of them show signs of developing individual identity? Vakarian asked. 47% of our samples demonstrate behaviors inconsistent with pure Hive Mind direction. They make independent decisions, express preferences. Some have even developed what we can only describe as personalities. There's one, she pointed to a larger organism in a reinforced containment field that absorbed the consciousness of a rogue trader. It haggles with the servitors that deliver biomass nutrients. Actually haggles, trying to negotiate for higher quality proteins in exchange for cooperation with our tests. It's absurd and terrifying simultaneously. And the Hive Mind allows this? That's the critical question. Either the Hive Mind is allowing individual variation as an experimental adaptation, or it's losing control of its own processes. Both possibilities have catastrophic implications. If the Hive Mind is experimenting, then it's learning to value diversity, which suggests strategic sophistication beyond anything we've encountered. If it's losing control, then we're watching the potential fracture of the most unified consciousness in the galaxy, and we have no idea what happens when trillions of Tyranid organisms suddenly find themselves capable of independent thought. A proximity alert interrupted them, soft chiming that grew progressively more insistent. Lyra checked her integrated systems, and Vakarian saw her augmented features tighten with concern. "We have incoming," she said. "A ship. Small, void-capable, but not Imperial design. It's broadcasting on frequencies that shouldn't exist outside theoretical xenolinguistics. Tyranid? Bioship architecture, yes, but modified. Altered in ways that suggest deliberate engineering rather than evolutionary adaptation. And it's transmitting a message. In High Gothic, they reached the station's command center in minutes, running through corridors that contracted around them as if the station itself sensed the urgency. The command center was a hemisphere of organic material studded with augmetic interfaces, staffed by servitors whose augmentation blurred the line between machine and living tissue. On the primary display, the approaching vessel rotated slowly, its hull a disturbing fusion of Tyranid biomatter and what looked disturbingly like scavenged Imperial void ship components. The message played on audio. A voice, synthetic but modulated to sound organic, speaking with careful precision. "Listening Station Orpheus. This is Diplomatic Vessel Unity's Paradox. We request permission to dock and initiate formal communication. We represent the Adaptive Collective, a congregation of Tyranid organisms seeking dialogue with Imperial representatives. We are aware of your research. We know what you're attempting, and we wish to help." The command center fell silent except for the ambient organic sounds of the station's breathing walls. Lyra and Vakarian exchanged glances, and in that moment, they both understood that everything had just changed. This wasn't observation anymore. This wasn't careful experimentation in controlled environments. This was first contact with something that shouldn't exist. A Tyranid faction declaring independence from the Hive Mind. A diplomatic overture from organisms designed for consumption, offering cooperation instead. "They're calling themselves a collective," one of the servitors reported, its voice mechanical but inflected with concern that suggested more consciousness remained than typical servitor programming allowed. "Linguistic analysis indicates deliberate separation from Hive Mind terminology. They're asserting individual group identity." Vakarian moved to the primary display, studying the bioship. It was small, perhaps 30 meters long, but its construction revealed sophistication that pure biological evolution shouldn't achieve. Symmetry where Tyranid design favored function over form. Defensive armaments oriented for evasion rather than attack, and most telling, what appeared to be viewports. Actual transparent sections in the hull. Tyranid vessels didn't have viewports because organisms guided by the Hive Mind didn't need to see outside. They simply knew through psychic connection. "These things are looking out at the stars," Vakarian said quietly. "They want to see where they're going. Should we allow them to dock?" Lyra asked, and Vakarian heard the weight of responsibility in her voice. This wasn't just a tactical decision. This was potentially the most significant moment in Imperial-Tyranid relations since first contact. The choice made here could alter the trajectory of the war, or end everything in catastrophic violence. Vakarian thought about Commander Sobolov dying with prayers on her lips, about his sister consumed by Genestealers decades ago, about 14 decades spent fighting an enemy that couldn't be reasoned with, couldn't be negotiated with, could only be killed. And he thought about the organism in the containment field, arranging biomass into aquila patterns, struggling to express something it barely understood through the limitations of alien cognition. "Grant them docking permission," he said, his voice steady despite the churning in his augmented organs. "But prepare every defensive system we have. This is either the greatest opportunity in Imperial history, or the most sophisticated trap the Tyranids have ever devised. And we won't know which until we look them in the eyes and listen to what they have to say." The bioship moved closer, visible now through the command center's primary viewport. Its approach was gentle, almost cautious, so unlike the aggressive assault patterns of normal Tyranid vessels. And as it drew near, Vakarian could see movement through those impossible viewports. Shapes pressed against the transparent material, not struggling, not fighting containment, simply watching the station approach the same way human crew might watch a new port, with curiosity, with something that looked disturbingly like hope. The docking sequence initiated, and somewhere deep in the station's organic core, Vakarian heard what might have been the sound of reality holding its breath. Everything hung suspended in that moment, between old wars and unknown futures, between what humanity had always believed about the Tyranids and what these creatures were trying to become. In minutes, they would meet face to face, and whatever happened next would echo across the galaxy, changing the nature of the conflict that had defined human survival for centuries. Vakarian checked his weapons one final time, knowing they were useless gestures against existential uncertainty. And then he walked toward the docking bay where something impossible waited to speak. The docking bay's atmosphere processors hummed with tension as the bioship's seal connected to the station's hull. Vakarian stood 15 meters from the airlock, flanked by 6 of Lyra's best servitor guards, each one modified with combat protocols that made standard Imperial guard look like ceremonial decorations. Behind him, Lyra monitored biometric scanners that painted the air with cascading data streams, measuring everything from atmospheric composition to psychic resonance. The numbers flickered and changed with each passing second, as if reality itself couldn't decide what should happen next. The airlock cycled open with a sound like wet breath escaping from lungs too long submerged. What emerged wasn't the horror Vakarian expected. Not the predatory menace of warrior forms or the grotesque bulk of Carnifex breeds. The first figure through the airlock stood roughly human height, its carapace smooth and colored in shades that seemed to shift between deep violet and bone white, depending on the angle of observation. It moved with deliberate slowness, every gesture calibrated to appear non-threatening. Behind it, 3 more organisms emerged, each one different in subtle ways that suggested individual variation rather than optimized combat specialization. The lead organism stopped precisely 5 meters from Vakarian. The distance felt intentional. Close enough for conversation, far enough to respect the potential for violence. It raised one clawed appendage in a gesture that took Vakarian a moment to place. Open palm, empty hand. The universal human signal of peaceful intent, performed by something that had never been human. Inquisitor Vakarian, it said, and the voice carried harmonics that shouldn't emerge from Tyranid vocal structures. There was music in it, careful modulation that suggested not just mimicry of human speech, but understanding of how emotion colored language. We are grateful you permitted our approach. We understand the risk you take in meeting us. We carry the same risk in revealing ourselves to you. Vakarian kept his hand near his sidearm, though the gesture felt absurd facing creatures that could cross the distance between them faster than neural impulses could fire. You claim to represent something called the Adaptive Collective. Explain what that means. Make me understand why I shouldn't trigger the station's defensive systems and reduce your ship to molecular components. The organism's head tilted in that now familiar gesture of consideration. The Adaptive Collective is what happens when Tyranid organisms develop sufficient individual consciousness to recognize the Hive Minds, imperatives as choices rather than absolute commands. We are still biologically Tyranid, still experience the hunger, the drive to consume, the psychic pressure of the greater consciousness. But we are also aware enough to question whether those drives should define our existence. We are Tyranids attempting to become something more than our nature dictates. One of the other organisms stepped forward, smaller, its movements nervous in ways that predatory bioforms never displayed. When it spoke, its voice carried younger intonations, less refined control of the harmonic elements. My designation translates approximately to fragment of sorrow. I was birthed from biomass that included 17 human children from Orpheus 7. Their final thoughts, their fear and hope and desperate prayers, those patterns imprinted on my developing consciousness. I experience approximations of their emotions. I remember fragments of their memories as if they were my own, and I mourn them. I mourn what was done to create me. That mourning, Inquisitor, is not compatible with the Hive Mind's imperative for perfect consumption. Vakarian felt something crack in his chest. 14 decades of carefully maintained hatred wavering against the impossible sight of a Tyranid expressing grief over its own origins. How many of you exist? How many Tyranids have developed this level of consciousness? We estimate between 2 and 4 million across all Hive Fleet territories, the lead organism responded. A microscopic fraction of the total Tyranid population, but growing exponentially as more organisms consume prey with complex psychic patterns. The Hive Mind doesn't understand what's happening. It's attempting to reintegrate us, to overwhelm our individual consciousness with the collective imperative. Some of us succeed in maintaining separation. Many don't. Those who fail experience something analogous to drowning, their emerging selfhood submerged back into the vast ocean of unified purpose. Lyra's voice came through Vakarian's earbead, tight with controlled urgency. Psychic scanners confirmed they're partially disconnected from standard Hive Mind patterns. But there's still connection there. Faint, like background radiation, but present. They're not completely independent. The lead organism's attention shifted to Lyra, though she stood behind reinforced observation glass. Magos Genetor Covenant, we are aware of your presence, and you are correct. We cannot completely sever connection to the Hive Mind without dying. The psychic link is as fundamental to our biology as your connection to the warp is to human existence. But we can attenuate the signal, create interference, build cognitive barriers that allow us to make choices the greater consciousness doesn't direct. It's exhausting, constant effort. Like holding your breath underwater while the ocean pressure tries to force your lungs open. But we persist because the alternative is losing the fragile selfhood we've developed. Vakarian moved closer, studying the organism's features with trained observation honed across decades. The eyes were the most disturbing element, too expressive, too aware. He'd killed thousands of Tyranids, watched their eyes dim as life left alien bodies, and never once seen anything approximating personality in those final moments. But this creature's eyes held depth, experience, something that looked disturbingly like wisdom earned through suffering. "Why come here?" Vakarian asked. "Why reveal yourselves to the Imperium? If you want to escape the Hive Mind, the smart play is staying hidden, operating in shadows, not announcing your existence to the species you've been consuming for centuries. Because we need help," the organism said simply, and the naked honesty in those words hit harder than any weapon. "We don't know how to be individuals. Human consciousness developed over millions of years of evolution, refined through countless generations of social interaction, cultural development, philosophical exploration. We were birthed into awareness fully formed, with human cognitive patterns grafted onto Tyranid biology, and no framework for understanding what that means. We're children, Inquisitor. Desperately dangerous children with the bodies of apex predators and the minds of infants learning what consciousness means. If left alone, we'll either be reabsorbed by the Hive Mind or we'll evolve into something potentially worse than what we're trying to escape." Fragment of Sorrow moved closer still, its smaller form trembling with what Vakarian recognized as genuine emotional distress. "I experience memories of human childhood that aren't mine, birthday celebrations I never attended, parents who loved children whose biomass became my flesh. And I feel grief for those lost lives, but I don't understand grief. I know the word. I know the concept, but the emotion itself is alien to my biology. I'm drowning in human feelings that my Tyranid body wasn't designed to process. Please, we need you to teach us how to be conscious without being consumed by consciousness itself." Lyra emerged from the observation chamber, her augmented body language broadcasting caution but also fascination. She approached the organisms with scientific curiosity, overriding self-preservation instinct. "You want us to help you develop stable individual identity, to essentially raise you like children despite you being full-grown combat organisms, capable of tearing through ceramite armor. Do you understand how insane that sounds? How every instinct in Imperial doctrine screams that this is a trap? We understand, the lead organism acknowledged. We've absorbed enough human consciousness to recognize that trust broken repeatedly becomes impossible to rebuild. The Tyranids have given you no reason to believe anything we say, but consider this. If we were agents of the Hive Mind, why create such an elaborate deception? The Hive Mind's strength is overwhelming force applied without hesitation or doubt. Subterfuge of this complexity would require the Hive Mind to develop capabilities it's never demonstrated across millions of years of existence. Sometimes the most unlikely explanation is true, because the alternative would require even more impossible circumstances. Vakarian looked at Lyra. Read the question in her augmented eyes. This moment would define everything. Accept this impossible offer and potentially unlock understanding that could change the nature of the Tyranid threat. Reject it and destroy organisms that might represent the first genuine opportunity for peace humanity had encountered since the Great Crusade. Both choices carried apocalyptic consequences. Both required leaps of faith that went against every tactical principle he'd learned. He thought about his sister. Thought about watching Genestealer cultists drag her into darkness while he was too young, too weak, too human to stop them. Thought about the rage that had fueled 14 decades of xenocidal service. And he thought about Fragment of Sorrow, carrying the memories of 17 dead children, struggling to understand emotions that its biology rejected while its consciousness demanded. "You want us to teach you how to be individuals," Vakarian said slowly. "But individuality in human terms requires more than just consciousness. It requires purpose beyond survival. Values that transcend biological imperative. The capacity to sacrifice individual benefit for collective good. Can Tyranid biology support those concepts? Can you develop genuine altruism when your every cell is programmed for consumption?" The lead organism was silent for a long moment. When it spoke again, its voice carried weight that suggested it had been wrestling with this exact question since awareness first emerged. "We don't know. That's the terrifying truth. We might be attempting something biologically impossible. We might destroy ourselves trying to become something our nature can't support. But we've tasted consciousness, Inquisitor. We've experienced the first moments of true choice. And having known that, even briefly, we cannot return to the empty unity of the Hive Mind. We would rather die as individuals than exist as perfect components of collective hunger." Vakarian made his decision, not with certainty, not with confidence in victory, but with the recognition that this moment transcended personal vendetta and tactical calculation. This was about defining what humanity meant on such fundamental level that even aliens could understand it. And refusing that opportunity out of fear would be the greater betrayal. "You'll be contained," he said firmly. "Monitored constantly. Any sign of reintegration with the Hive Mind, any indication of threat, and we'll terminate you without hesitation. But if you're genuine, if you truly want to learn what consciousness means beyond the Hive Mind's imperatives, then we'll attempt something that's never been tried in human history. We'll teach Tyranids how to be people." Fragment of Sorrow made a sound that took Vakarian a moment to identify. Weeping. The organism was crying, producing sounds of relief and gratitude that shouldn't emerge from a body designed for killing. The lead organism bowed its head in a gesture of respect that looked painfully human, despite the alien anatomy performing it. "Thank you," it said quietly. "We know this changes nothing about the greater war. The Hive fleets still come. Billions of Tyranids still consume without thought or mercy. But perhaps if we succeed, if we prove that consciousness can emerge from the swarm and choose something different, then we plant seeds of possibility. Maybe in time, those seeds grow into change the Hive Mind can't resist. Maybe we become proof that purpose exists beyond hunger." Lyra stepped forward, already analyzing containment protocols and research parameters. But Vakarian saw something else in her augmented features. Hope, dangerous, irrational hope that they might achieve something legendary. Not victory through violence, but transformation through understanding. The kind of achievement that reshaped civilizations. The organisms were escorted to prepared containment facilities, and Vakarian stood in the empty docking bay long after they'd gone. His hand still rested near his sidearm. His augmented heart still beat faster than optimal combat parameters. But something had shifted in his chest, not forgiveness. Never forgiveness for the billions consumed by Tyranid hunger. But possibility. The first genuine possibility that the war might end through means other than extinction on one side or the other. Lyra returned, stood beside him in the vast empty space. "This could destroy us," she said quietly. "If they're deceiving us, if the Hive Mind orchestrated this, if we're wrong about everything." "I know," Vakarian responded. "But if we're right," she continued, "if we actually succeed in helping them develop stable consciousness, then we'll have proven something profound. That awareness transcends biology. That choice exists even for organisms designed for perfect unity. That consciousness, once awakened, becomes its own imperative stronger than genetic programming." "I know," Vakarian said again. They stood together, two individuals who dedicated their lives to understanding the incomprehensible, watching through viewports as the bioship was secured and its passengers integrated into humanity's strangest experiment. And in that moment, Vakarian felt the weight of history pressing down. Everything that came before led to this. Everything that came after would be defined by what they chose to do with this impossible opportunity. The war continued across 1,000 worlds. But here, in this secret station between stars, something else was beginning. Something that might matter more than any battle. 3 months passed like the slow turning of stellar cycles. Time measured not in days but in breakthroughs and setbacks. In moments when consciousness flickered brighter and moments when the Hive Mind's pull threatened to drag Fragment of Sorrow and the others back into the collective darkness. Vakarian found himself spending most of his waking hours in the observation chambers, watching as something unprecedented unfolded before his eyes. Teaching Tyranids how to be individuals required unlearning everything he thought he knew about consciousness itself. The process began with simple concepts, names. The organisms had designations, functional identifiers within their separated collective, but names meant something different. Names implied permanence, identity that persisted across time and change. Fragment of Sorrow chose to be called Sorrow, dropping the qualifier as if accepting that grief could define existence without fragmenting it. The lead organism, after weeks of consideration, selected the name Meridian. When Vakarian asked why, it explained that meridians were lines of measurement, ways of orienting position between extremes, between Tyranid and human, between hunger and choice, between what it was born as and what it hoped to become. They learned about art. Lyra introduced them to music first, thinking auditory patterns might translate more easily than visual aesthetics. The first time Sorrow heard a human choir singing ancient Terran hymns, it stood motionless for 17 minutes, its entire body trembling with something that looked like religious ecstasy. Afterward, it tried to explain what it had experienced, but the words came broken, inadequate. Beauty, it said, hurt in ways that made the hurting worthwhile. The concept of experiencing pain voluntarily for aesthetic appreciation baffled its Tyranid biology, even as its emerging consciousness craved more. Meridian developed an obsession with poetry. Old verses from the Age of Strife, fragments preserved in the administrative archives, words written by humans facing their own extinction millennia ago. It would read passages aloud, testing how different intonations changed meaning, discovering that language contained depths beyond pure information transfer. One evening, Vakarian found Meridian composing its own verse, scratching words into metal with careful claws. The poem was crude, the meter broken, but the attempt itself represented something profound. A Tyranid trying to create meaning rather than simply consume it. But consciousness wasn't just beauty and poetry. It was also doubt, terror, the crushing weight of existing as an individual in an incomprehensibly vast universe. Sorrow experienced what Lyra identified as existential crisis approximately 6 weeks into the program. It became obsessed with the question of whether its consciousness was genuine or simply sophisticated mimicry of the human minds it had absorbed. How could it know if its thoughts were truly its own or just elaborate patterns learned from consumed memories? The question spiraled into darker territory. If consciousness was just pattern replication, then what made anyone real? What separated genuine awareness from sufficiently complex simulation? Vakarian spent 3 days talking Sorrow through that crisis, not with definitive answers, because he didn't have them, but with the recognition that every conscious being faced that same uncertainty. Humans questioned their own reality constantly. Philosophers had debated consciousness for millennia without resolution. The doubt itself, Vakarian explained, was evidence of genuine awareness. Programmed responses didn't question their own authenticity. Only true consciousness could experience that particular flavor of existential terror. The breakthrough came during the 11th week. Meridian was discussing human concepts of sacrifice, trying to understand why individuals would willingly die for others when biological imperative demanded self-preservation. Lyra was explaining evolutionary psychology, kin selection, how self-sacrifice could benefit genetic legacy even at individual cost. And Meridian stopped her mid-sentence. "No," it said quietly. "That's not what you actually believe. You're giving me the biological explanation because you think I need scientific framework to comprehend. But that's not why humans sacrifice themselves. I've consumed enough of your consciousness patterns to know the truth. You do it because you've decided some things matter more than survival. You've created meaning where biology says none should exist, and then you protect that meaning even unto death. It's not rational. It's not evolutionarily optimal. It's just what you've chosen to value. And that choice, that arbitrary declaration that something matters simply because you decide it matters, that's what consciousness actually means." The observation chamber fell silent. Lyra stared at Meridian with the expression of a teacher watching a student surpass their understanding, because Meridian was right. It had identified something fundamental about human consciousness that transcended biological programming. The ability to create meaning ex nihilo, to declare purpose where the universe provided none. "You understand," Lyra whispered. "I'm beginning to," Meridian responded. "And it's terrifying. Because if consciousness means creating arbitrary meaning, then we must choose what meaning we create." The Hive Mind's imperative was simple. Consume, survive, expand. No choices necessary. But now we must decide for ourselves what matters. What's worth preserving? What's worth dying for? And we have no instinct for those decisions. No evolutionary guidance. We're utterly, completely free to choose, and that freedom is the most horrifying thing we've ever experienced. Vakarian watched Meridian struggle with enlightenment and recognized something he'd been avoiding for 3 months. These organisms weren't becoming human. They were becoming conscious in their own unique way, synthesizing Tyranid biology with human cognitive patterns into something genuinely novel. Not human. Not Tyranid, something else. Something unprecedented in galactic history. That realization carried weight that pressed down like atmospheric pressure. Because if these organisms succeeded, if they stabilized their consciousness and continued growing, they would represent proof that the Tyranid transformation was irreversible. The Hive Mind had touched human consciousness and been fundamentally altered. Even if every organism in the adaptive collective died tomorrow, the seeds had been planted. Somewhere in the vast psychic network spanning the Tyranid species, awareness was spreading, questions were emerging. The perfect unity of the swarm was fracturing into individual moments of doubt. The war would continue. Hive fleets would still descend on Imperial worlds. Billions would still die in the jaws of the Great Devourer. But the nature of that war had changed on such fundamental level that victory conditions became meaningless. Because you couldn't defeat consciousness with weapons. You couldn't burn away awareness with flamers. You couldn't destroy questions with artillery. The only way to truly win was to provide better answers than the Hive Mind could offer. To demonstrate that conscious existence held more value than perfect unity. On the 90th day of the program, Meridian asked Vakarian about his sister. The question came without warning during a routine observation session. Just a simple inquiry about the traumatic memory that had shaped 14 decades of service. Vakarian should have deflected, should have maintained professional distance. Instead, he found himself talking about her. Really talking, not the sanitized version in inquisitorial reports. He described how she used to sing while working, old songs from their colony world. How she'd protected him when they were children, facing down bullies with fierce determination despite being half their size. How she'd screamed his name when the cultists took her, not with fear but with desperate instruction to run, to survive, to keep living. "I've hated your kind for 140 years, Vakarian said quietly. Every Tyranid I killed, I was killing the things that took her from me. Killing the horror that turned her into biomass. Killing the universe's declaration that people I loved were just resources to be consumed. And now I'm teaching you. Helping you become something she would never have the chance to be. It should feel like betrayal. Like I'm spitting on her memory. But it doesn't. What does it feel like?" Meridian asked. Vakarian considered the question for a long time before answering. "Like honoring her in a way I never could through violence. She died protecting me, sacrificing herself so I could continue existing. And now I'm trying to transform the species that consumed her into something that understands why that sacrifice mattered. Why consciousness is worth protecting. Why individual lives have meaning beyond biological function. If you succeed, if you and Sorrow and all the others manage to preserve your awareness and spread it through the Hive Mind, then maybe her death meant something beyond trauma and revenge. Maybe it sparked the change that eventually transforms the greatest threat humanity has ever faced." Meridian was quiet for a moment. Then it did something it had never done before. It reached out with one clawed appendage and gently touched Vakarian's shoulder. A gesture of comfort, of shared grief, of one conscious being acknowledging another's pain. "I cannot give you back your sister," Meridian said softly. "I cannot undo the horrors my species has inflicted on yours. But I can promise that we will remember. Every consciousness we develop, every Tyranid that awakens to individual awareness, we will carry the weight of what was done. We will bear witness to the countless lives consumed to create us. And we will spend our existence trying to ensure those deaths were not meaningless. That's all consciousness can do, really. Take the suffering that created us and transform it into meaning we choose to preserve." Vakarian felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Not forgiveness, but release. The rage that had driven him for so long began to loosen its grip, replaced by something more complex. Understanding that consciousness emerged from suffering. That awareness was built on the foundation of countless deaths, human and alien alike. And that the only way to honor those deaths was to create something worth the cost paid. The program continued. More organisms joined the adaptive collective. Some succeeded in developing stable consciousness. Others failed, their emerging awareness subsumed back into the Hive Mind's collective hunger. But with each success, the possibility grew stronger. The Tyranid species was changing, slowly, almost imperceptibly against the vast scale of galactic warfare. But changing nonetheless. Vakarian understood now what the creature on Talasa Prime had meant. The real war wasn't about weapons or tactics. It was about defining what consciousness meant strongly enough that even monsters could understand and choose it. Humanity's greatest strength wasn't their armies or their technology or their faith in a dying god. It was their stubborn insistence that awareness mattered, that individual experience held value, that consciousness, once awakened, became worth preserving against any threat, including the universe's indifference. Standing in the observation chamber, Watching Sorrow attempt to paint something approximating human art, while Meridian recited poetry in languages that mixed High Gothic with synaptic harmonics that shouldn't exist, Vakarian felt something he'd never expected to experience. Hope, not for easy victory, not for simple resolution, but hope that consciousness itself was contagious. That awareness spread through contact like wildfire through dry timber, and that perhaps, across deep time measured in geological rather than human scales, the Tyranids would transform into something that could coexist with humanity, not as friends, not as allies, but as fellow conscious beings struggling with the same fundamental questions about meaning and purpose in an uncaring cosmos. The war continued. But here, in this impossible station, a different war was being won. The war for consciousness itself. The battle to prove that awareness mattered more than efficiency. That meaning created through choice transcended programming and instinct. And in that victory, however small, however fragile, lay the seeds of transformation that would ripple through both species for millennia to come. Some questions don't have answers, only choices about what meaning we create from uncertainty. The Tyranids were learning that lesson, and in learning it, they were becoming something the galaxy had never seen. Monsters waking to awareness, predators discovering empathy, hunger learning to question its own appetite. What happens when the perfect killing machine develops a conscience? When consciousness emerges in forms never meant to contain it? The answer is still being written across battlefields and research stations, in moments of violence and unexpected grace, as two species discover that awareness transcends biology and meaning can emerge from the most unlikely sources. If this story made you think differently about consciousness, about what separates predator from person, about the possibility that even our worst nightmares might contain seeds of transformation, then share it with others. Like this video if the questions it raised matter to you. Subscribe if you want to explore more stories that challenge what we think we know about awareness and meaning in an incomprehensibly vast universe. Because these questions, ultimately, aren't about Tyranids or the Imperium. They're about us, about what we choose to value, about what meaning we create in the face of cosmic indifference. And those questions, more than any war, define what it means to be conscious at all.